Welcome everybody to the second webinar in the series that the G20 Interfaith Forum and Praeveni Global are running prior to the G20 in South Africa in November. This month, our focus is on corporate governance and its importance in the anti-modern slavery and anti-human trafficking movement. And I'm really pleased to be joined by three experts in this area. First, Abby Wilhelm, who's at Hogan Lovells. Abby served as Chief of Staff of the Office of the Attorney General for District of Columbia. Her expertise lies in the convergence of policy, communications, and strategy, and is Senior Policy Advisor at Hogan Lovells. Joined by Reverend Sarah Duggan, who is the Director of Compliance Investigations and Corporate Responsibility Program and Professor of Law at Columbus School of Law at Catholic University of America. Prior to coming to Catholic University's law school, Sarah was the Vice President General Counsel of the National Railroad Passenger Corporation, and she serves as priest of St. John's Episcopal Church, Georgetown Parish in DC. And finally, Reverend David Schilling. David is Senior Advisor to the Interfaith Center of Corporate Responsibility. David joined the ICCR in 1994 and has worked with the ICCR members and allies to engage corporations, cross-sectoral and multi-stakeholder initiatives on human rights in corporate operations and global supply chains. Thank you all for joining me. This week was very, very sad news at the passing of Pope Francis, and we wanted to say a few words about his support for the anti-modern slavery movement. I have a couple of quotes that demonstrate that importance from Pope Francis that I think are important. And I'm going to read those quotes and one other message that was put out by a very, I think, globally important environmental activist who wrote very well about Pope Francis' commitment to social and environmental causes. And then I'm going to ask Reverend David Schilling to lead us in a prayer. Pope Francis said, "Let us help one another to be more responsive, to open our lives and hearts to our sisters and brothers who even now are being bought and sold as slaves. It is never too late to take action. Human trafficking is an open wound on the body of contemporary society, a scourge upon the body of Christ. It is a crime against humanity." And I think that is clear and succinct. Bill McKibben wrote on the morning of his passing, "Just in case I thought one could feel more forlorn right now, the word came this morning that the death of Pope Francis. It hit me hard, not because I'm a Catholic, I'm a Methodist, but because I've always felt buoyed by his remarkable spirit. If he could bring new hope and energy to an institution as complex as the Vatican, there is reason for us all to go on working in our own complex institutions. And if he could stand so completely in solidarity with the world's poor and vulnerable, then it gave the rest of us something to aim for. I thought this from the start when he became the first pope to choose the name Francis. That countercultural blaze of possibility in a dark time, and when he showed his mastery of the art of gesture, washing the feet of women, of prisoners, and of Muslim refugees. The world is a poorer place with his passing, but a far richer one for his having lived." I thought I would read those, and I will ask the Reverend David Schilling to lead us in a prayer.
Thank you so much, Duncan. Let us pray. Dear God of infinite light and love, we give great thanks for the life and legacy of Pope Francis. He showed us how to respect the dignity of each and every human being, and especially those who have been made vulnerable by economic systems, by poverty, racism, war, human trafficking, modern slavery. To the end, he uplifted immigrants, victims of violence, and preached the need for each of us to treasure the earth and keep it alive for generations and generations to come. We join this day in mourning the loss of Pope Francis, and we give thanks for his uncommon contributions to humanity through his vision and witness and humble spirit. Amen.
Thank you very much, David. We'll start the webinar now, and let's remind any attendees who wish to ask questions, send us a note, sort of state their interests and how we might address those. Please do so as we're speaking. This is a conversation, so we can pick them up as we go along and incorporate ideas or questions that you have. So what we're actually going to do to begin with is try and get a baseline of knowledge of what corporate governance is and how it functions. And so there are going to be a few slides to look at first. And these are slides that I actually use in my own teaching at University of Southern California in the sustainability master's course that I have. And the first thing I want to do is frame how we look at corporate governance, in what environment or ecosystem does it function. So this is a really nice illustration of the global food system, and within it are all these different actors working in their own ways, with their own incentives and their own purposes to bring us and grow food. Now, it's defined as a complex system, and the reason for that is that it's constantly moving and dynamic. Everybody is adapting to everybody else. It is not linear. It is not in any way predictive. But what happens is you have the largest actors who are the most powerful. They tend to move the system or bias it in particular ways, whether they be governments, large corporations. Those that are small and have little power in the system, and they might be numerous, individual workers, for example, they will be part of it, but they will have no power to change the system to benefit themselves necessarily. And that's where exploitation occurs. Now, each slide, I'm going to ask the speakers whether they want to add anything to that. So I'm just going to throw that open. And Sarah, you had a point earlier that you'd like to make.
Thank you, Duncan, and I am honored to be part of this panel today. So thank you very much for including me. Yeah, my point was that this picture, just like reality, is intimidating. But I do think that just like in each of our own lives, we have to find ways to wade through complexity. We have to figure out how to prioritize risks, especially to the poorest and most vulnerable people, workers in global supply chains, people who are victims in any way of human trafficking. And I think in light of the topic here, corporate governance becomes a way of making sense of some of these systems. Corporations have to be nimble. That's a word that keeps coming up more and more these days. In the midst of complexity, nimbleness is really important, but there are really a great convergence of interests from the workers who are so often exploited to investors who have the money to put into these systems, and the public. We're all interested in strong corporate governance. And in a way, this complex slides shows why it is so important to find a path through all of this. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. David?
Yes, this is really, really helpful. And thanks, Sarah. This chart shows the complexity, but to break it down a bit in terms of a very specific issue, the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility has been working with stakeholders in Maharashtra in India, where the sugarcane sector has been a real difficult problem to the workers and to those that work in refineries. And sometimes this is how corporate governance changed. After a New York Times article describing the situation in southern India in the sugarcane sector, where women were, forced to have hysterectomies, and there was a lot of forced labor involved. But as we started to engage about 15 companies that were using sugar, we found that at first the companies said they really weren't aware of, and yet by within a short period of time, a number of the key leaders, to kind of change their governance to look at deeper in their supply chain and to really start an organization as trying to address the issue. And the workers and others started. The Coalition of Immokalee Workers started this a long time ago, but a Fair Food Council program. It's now being established in southern India. So the structure, the governance, flexibility of when there's an issue, really trying to address, bringing in different stakeholders and putting in systems in place like the Fair Food Program that in this sector is so really important because it involves workers as well as the companies themselves.
No, thank you, David. Abby, was there anything you wanted to add to this, or?
Yeah, thanks, Duncan. It's just echo Sarah's comment, which is that it's truly a privilege to be with this panel here today and with everyone who's joined. So very grateful for that. I think to Sarah's point, not only does this demonstrate a lot of complexity and us needing to kind of weed through the noise and be nimble, but what it also demonstrates, and I heard Sarah say this before we started, is these systems are run by human beings. They impact human beings, and we can't take out the human element of business, of corporations, and how they have a ripple effect across the entire world. And so to David's point, you know, we've seen a lot of advocacy come out through different reporting, including in the New York Times, that's revealed some issues with certain corporations and their supply chains. And if we're here to talk today about corporate governance, we should really just take a step back and ask ourselves, what are we trying to accomplish with corporate governance? And in my view, one really critical element is transparency, because what we've learned over time is that the more transparent we can be about our operations, we being companies and corporations, the more we can effectuate change. So being able to pull out the data and understand these complex systems is not easy, but the more we do, the more likely we are to effectuate change. So just wanted to add that.
No, that's wonderful. Thank you all, because what I would be great for anyone who's for our attendees to understand is that we obviously want change. We want companies to adapt, but we don't want them to adapt what we might call maladapt. We don't want them to impose coercion. We don't want them to create conditions of forced labor. We want them to adapt in a way that helps and creates a better work conditions, helps workers. And so the system will keep working and moving. No one can control it. And that's an example, for instance, with a tariff policy. You start to impose tariffs everywhere. The system is not just going to say, well, okay, sure, we give in. Everyone is going to adapt in different ways, and it's not predictable or controllable because there's so many different kinds of agents, both individuals and companies and others, as we said. But we do want it to adapt, but we want it to adapt in a way that is to the benefit of the workers. So how might we think about that a bit more? Well, we've got to remember that in external, and for a corporation, there are external stakeholders, external actors on it. There is the stock market and money. Obviously, the whole purpose of setting up a company is, in theory, to be making profits. So there is the stock market providing capital for that. And that might be also individual shareholders. There are then boards of supervisors and so forth. And there are auditors of various types. Some auditors, financial auditors, have their own professional bodies, the chartered accountants bodies. Other professional auditors, a little bit of a dig, social auditors, no professional body. So there are other than external auditors, external stakeholders to the external stakeholders. Governments, regulators, regulators of regulators, Government Accountability Office, for example, influencers, the social kind, sure, because they can be powerful in all sorts of ways, negative and positive for our purposes, but many other stakeholders, civil society being an example, ourselves, the G20 and so forth. And then more obvious ones, the employees themselves, the workers, unions, stakeholders in buyers and suppliers, their banks, their finances. And so the system grows and we start to be able to kind of illustrate and imagine it. But not all shareholders and stakeholders are equal. Some stakeholders are extremely powerful, governments, certain companies, certain banks, but they may not be very interested in this problem. So they could be powerful, but not particularly interested. And some are very small, but extremely interested in the problem, for instance, that we're interested in. And then there are going to be some that are large and interested, and they might be our allies, for example. It is not going to be everybody. Do any of the panel want to sort of add to that point about power and interest and the difficulties of capturing that interest in stakeholders that are important for our purposes? Yeah, Sarah.
I think it's great to keep this kind of thing in mind, and really it is about empowering. But one of the developments in, say, the last, well, technically maybe 25 years, but only in more recent years, and that is the development of compliance and ethics programs having to be put in place throughout the corporate world. And that dates back to 1991 with the US Organizational Sentencing Guidelines. It was given a real boost with a Delaware judicial decision in 1996 with Caremark. But as we go forward, one of the things that I think helps all of these shareholders is if one can have a compliance and ethics program that has true integrity. That's a kind of governance step, and making those programs robust that helps with all of these different stakeholders, and perhaps gives a bit of a boost of power if you truly have a good grievance process, a good way of getting information from the lower part of the corporate hierarchy to the higher part.
Yeah, that's very, very important. And I'm going to come back to that, and particularly the idea of integrity and movement of information. David?
From a governance perspective, I think one of the key issues, whether it's forced labor, human trafficking, modern slavery, it's really around this whole concept of human rights due diligence. So in 2011, the UN Human Rights Council unanimously passed the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And I think partly that has shaped the kind of the ecosystem moving forward as companies look at that and integrate it as other stakeholders, and of course governments who have the responsibility, of course, and to really not only respect human rights but protect. So I think partly, Duncan, it's a governance structure that takes seriously not just the protocols around human rights due diligence, which really is looking at, sort of checking the whole global value chain for human rights and environmental risks, and the directives that we have come out in Europe and so forth. We can talk later about that, but really it helps companies to look at and find ways to identify, prevent, and mitigate actual and potential human rights or environmental impacts. So that has really been a seminal kind of framework that we as investors have used, and of course companies have adopted, but we don't want to do sort of due diligence light. We want to make sure that it gets to the ground and also really engages those, as you were saying earlier, Duncan, who may have less power but are so critical, the workers and the communities from which they come.
Thank you, David. Abby, is there anything you want to add at this point?
Yeah, I can't help but look at this slide and think about how important employees are as a stakeholder, and how often they are, I think, we fail to see how powerful their voice can be. Not only is their voice in making sure that the companies that they work for represent their values and are doing right by the communities in which they operate, by acknowledging human rights and making sure that their supply chains are void of any human trafficking or labor trafficking or the like, but also in attracting talent. People want to work for companies that care about the people that they interact with, whether it's, halfway across the world or right next door. So that's just when I see this, I always am reminded of how much we underestimate our employees and the power that they have.
So I'm going to take that thought, and then if we go to the next slide, let's think a bit about how the internal governance works. So once you go inside the company, for those attendees who don't know me, I worked as a general counsel across Asia Pacific. We had subsidiaries at the bottom here. We had about 16 subsidiaries across 16 countries, but also a bunch of offshore arrangements across about another, I would say, 10 offshore jurisdictions as well. So I'm quite familiar with this kind of in and out here. And so we have the shells on top, putting pressure on the boards of directors to make money, do business in a particular way that might be in a way that pursues sustainability, social issues, or it might not be. It might be like, no, hard numbers, shareholder primacy, and we'll come back to that. A corporate board across on the right where the audit comes from. And then down below, and this is different in different jurisdictions, but essentially internal controls, management policy committee, president, there is an exco, there is a C-suite, and as we might executive committee, audit supervising director, the accounts and finance, and then down below the functions, business strategy, human resource of importance to us, legal, also importance to us, risk management and compliance, as Sarah said, and then the actual businesses below in maybe lots of different countries, manufacturing in Vietnam or in Kenya or in Canada or wherever it might be, but also then all the relationships that come out of that are managed by procurement. And then on the bottom, we have factory floors, plantations, fishing vessels, where these workers, as Abby and David mentioned, that's where they exist and they live, and then they're earning their wages. And getting information from the bottom to the top, as Sarah described, it should be easy, right? We should be able to just go there and do that. But for some reason, and I think there is some of them are malicious reasons, and some of them are reasons of incompetence, and some of the reasons of just callousness, that information does not make it to the top. And we're trying to, one of the things we want to achieve, obviously, is that that information starts to flow. What does this look like? What types of behavior are we trying to get to? And we're going to come back to this slide. So I'm just going to go to the one after this, which is the final one. When we're thinking about conduct and behavior in a corporation, we're thinking about the governance that comes from that. Then we think about organizational culture. We think about values and belief systems, organizational structure, and we think about the stakeholders as we discussed. And what does that look like at a micro level? At a micro level, when you're building governance, I mean, I've been fortunate to do this a few times, both in the purchase of companies and in the companies that I've worked at as we bought them, is that you have 3 lines of defense. This is the basics of governance. Is it you have an audit service that looks at it, you have the compliance department, as Sarah mentioned, and then here is the slight problem. The first line of defense for compliance and governance is going to be the actual business department themselves. And that means that the people who are managing things are also looking at their own risk, which is somewhat circular. And that's where we have a problem on shop floors, factory floors, plantations, where you have managers and supervisors of workforces who are supposed to be evaluating the risk of them doing things that are obviously contrary to the governance. And this is where we have a failure. And so I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to come back to this slide. And there's an old phrase, a bit of a misquote from Peter Drucker, which was, culture eats strategy for breakfast. You can try and do things in a particular company, but the culture of the company will win out your attempt to actually try and get these things done. Abby.
Yeah, I'm so struck by your comment, Duncan, about information flows and information happening at one level, not trickling its way up to the top. And I do have to say that anybody who's ever worked at a company can understand firsthand how, especially for large corporations, how hard it is to get information flowing in an efficient way so that everyone knows what's happening. The left hand knows what the right hand is doing, right?
Yeah.
But it has to happen. And there is a movement right now, and an expectation that's been growing over decades that corporations and companies have an obligation to track this information and to share it. And the way that that is emphasized and prioritized by the top will trickle down to the bottom. So I say that to recognize that it is a continued challenge for companies that they have to confront because the pressure is on.
Yeah. Sarah, do you want to comment? I'm just going to say something, then come to David.
Well, go ahead. Go ahead.
No,
Please.
I was going to say, I completely agree with that. I mean, there's a question come in about jurisdictions and compliance. And I think the US put out the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, which was a great act requiring information about financial risk. And it pushed companies that were listed in the US to suddenly provide a lot of disclosure and information. And people didn't like that. Where I worked at the time, we were, in order to comply, there was a lot of hand-wringing and why should we do this? But at the same time, if you wanted access to the US stock market, then you had to comply with that. Another more subtle example was in the Dodd-Frank Act, which used to have the conflict minerals disclosure. And I personally was very fond of that because every quarter we would have to rush around all our investments. And at that point in time, we managed about $120 billion. And we were like, are we investing in conflict minerals, or are we investing in a company that might be benefiting from it? And it was a kind of mad dash to find out something that we should really have known every day of the week. But exactly as Abby said, getting that information and making it flow was impossible. And we need to think that in the context in which we're asking people to adapt and to change, to benefit the things that we care about, there's going to have to be a lot of restructuring. It is not simply about outcomes. It is about making sure that when you're at the top of this tree, that you want people to be paid on time. The systems are in place to make that happen. That there is knowledge of this worker in this place who gets paid at the end of this week in this amount. It is not about the bottom situation saying, why didn't you do this? It's about making sure that the system's in place for that to happen. And that is a cross-jurisdictional issue because it is fundamentally a structural and organizational one rather than a legal one. But the law should require that to happen, and that is not always the case. Sarah, sorry.
Well, thank you. I think the points that Duncan, that you and Abby have made are critically important, and the information flow, how that works, is what I guess the term's information asymmetries. They're rife in all sorts of large, complex corporations. But the tone at the top has something to do with that. And I think that was an impetus for Sarbanes-Oxley back in 2002, was to say, after the Enron debacle, after we had CEOs saying, well, gee, I'm not an accountant, I'm not a finance person. Well, it's also true that CEOs and directors may not be experts on human trafficking. But it wasn't enough in Sarbanes-Oxley to say, oh, I don't understand the finances of my own company. It shouldn't be enough to say, I don't understand what's happening in my own supply chains. Granted, I do understand that it's incredibly complex, but I think there are some things that could be done. And in a way, the new EU directive that entered into force last July and will start to come on board with domestic legislation probably in the next year or two, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, may put in place some of the kinds of requirements that Sarbanes-Oxley did with respect to internal control systems. I think that's critical. The other thing that's critical is tying these kinds of measures to compensation. There's nothing that motivates people more, I think, than understanding, yes, first and foremost, we have to make money. And if I own stock in the company, in addition to my bonuses, my stock or my stock options are increasing in value. It's a really good reminder to be good in certain ways when your paycheck is linked to that, just the way someone at the bottom of the chain is linked to how many sugarcane plants they pick or whatever in the day. I think that's critical too.
Yeah, I'm smiling because after the crash in 2008, I was, I along with, it was a company that I was in was 100,000+, and I was identified as one of a few thousand key people, and we were asked to sign a 5-year clawback, so that if we were found to have been involved or part of or responsible for some issue that had caused the crash, or at least within the organization, they could claw back 5 years of our salary. And that was a problem because I'd obviously spent it at that point. So when I signed it, I was thinking, I had a choice. I could not have signed it and left the business, but then they said, well, we could also come and just sue you. So I also wanted to fix the things that I'd seen. So I think that's a very important point. Linking remuneration to outcomes has a very strong effect. David. You're on mute, sir.
There's so many things to say, and I really appreciate what's been said. I might want to pick up just a little bit, Sarah, from your reference to the corporate sustainability due diligence directive, and talk about that in the context of some of the other things that are taking place in this space. And I mean, to me, our organization that does have European investors, and we started this Investor Alliance for Human Rights in 2018, that now has about over 200 more members that aren't all ICCR members, but the assets under management now are about 21 trillion. So that's a substantial amount of capital, but it's really working towards not only corporate responsibility to respect human rights and look at the governance structures around that, but investors' responsibility to respect human rights. And so that's a big piece of where we've been working. But I think from the corporate governance perspective, it'll be really interesting to see how over time that the corporate sustainability due diligence director really has very specific expectations of uh, board of directors. So they have a duty of care, and they really need to be responsible by making sure that management and then the entire system is moving in the direction of human rights due diligence throughout the value chain. That's a big order, but we know that there are companies that are doing that. There are also new techniques to do that kind of mapping. But for us, I think the best governance is having that top be level playing field for companies. And I think that's one of the reasons that a lot of the European companies wanted to get the corporate sustainability due diligence directive, so that there weren't laggards that were getting away with forced labor, but you get a real playing field. But that has to be supplemented by, worker-driven social responsibility. So if you have both of those operating, and the worker-driven social responsibility, I think you mentioned earlier, Duncan, about the coalition of Immokalee workers. That's a really important model, and it's taking hold not only in the U.S. but elsewhere, and through the Pakistan Accord, the Accord for Building Safety, which has another governance structure. I think that's really critical, with companies working with trade unions, the ILO being kind of the chair, the independent chair. But I do feel like this is very fluid, and we need to make sure that as we move forward, because no one, I think the companies nor the investors, got everything they wanted in the corporate sustainability due diligence. And there were some changes at the end where certain sectors, like the financial sector, were left out, although that's probably going to be brought in a couple of years. But if we look at the whole ecosystem, like you were really asking us to do with your slides, I think we need to really pay attention to what's having the most impact, on all the different stakeholders, and especially those that are most vulnerable. And that's
Let's go to some of those, David. So we put up this, and I'm going to stop sharing now. And what I want to focus on now is some of the stakeholders, and those, in the area of corporate governance, we often talk about shareholder primacy versus stakeholder theory. And what does that really mean? Well, under the law, and I'm going to ask Sarah to comment on Delaware, for example, is that when you establish a company and you have shareholders, the business of the company, the organization, should be functioning to the benefit of the shareholders, and that every other stakeholder is secondary to that. And Milton Friedman wrote about this in the 70s in his famous article in the New York Times in relation to the importance of shareholder primacy, and that let businesses be businesses and they'll take care of everything else. Obviously, that hasn't quite worked out. So theory came, and a man called Freeman, not Friedman, he in the 90s, he created, well, in a way, he kind of set out, because it had already been happening, he articulated the idea of stakeholder theory. And so now we had two competing ideas. One is business thinking about everybody, everything around it, and then business as a thing that thinks about one thing, shareholders. So I wanted to throw that open to you to comment about that kind of conflict and dynamic.
Okay, I'd be happy to talk about that.
Yeah.
I think the whole idea of shareholder primacy, in a way, it was always part of what was going on because businesses existed to make money. That's why people invested in them. But it really reached its peak, as you said, Duncan, in the 1980s, and it was a go-go time of mergers and acquisitions. But at the same time, in the late 80s and into the 90s, we had something like 31, 32 states in the United States creating alternative constituency statutes, saying that in making decisions, members of the board of directors would be protected if they consider the interests of other constituents who were not the shareholders, constituents such as employees and communities. Those statutes never really had the power that I think many people hoped that they would, but still they do exist. Delaware never adopted that kind of a statute, but they did make clear, the Delaware Supreme Court made clear, I think in a case about Revlon, what are called Revlon duties, and has been changed many times since that decision. But the idea that that strict duty to consider only the creation of maximum value for shareholders really is somewhat circumscribed. And even Delaware doesn't seem to be saying you can only think about money for your shareholders. Recently, just in the end of March of this year, Delaware changed a couple of key provisions in its corporate law that now give controlling shareholders more power. And that's, I think, not necessarily a good development for those of us concerned about these areas, because I think we want strong laws and strong limitations on what anyone can do, especially a shareholder with the kind of power that a controlling shareholder has. It would take a lot to go into all of that, but I think it's part of a trend to be a little bit nervous about things like ESG, to be a little bit nervous about how we circumscribe contractual power within organizations. And my fear is that that's really benefiting those who are wealthiest and most powerful rather than workers and other folks who are most vulnerable. That doesn't have to continue. And I think it's really important to keep working on the kinds of laws that we see emerging with the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive in Europe. We have a little bit of that perhaps with the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act in the United States, but I think we need to work more for those kinds of laws. So, and I think that I just want to say one more thing, that the biggest issue there may be an issue of metrics. We know how to measure whether a company's making money. It's much harder to say, are we doing a good job as directors if what we're doing is spending resources looking through our supply chain to make sure that we act with integrity and don't exploit vulnerable people. We have to keep working on how to do that.
No, that's great. And we're all nodding feverishly. And I'm going to turn this over to Abby, because I think when we talk about metrics and we talk about these communications and these sort of influences from major shareholders, and then the lack of voice of other stakeholders, we are always talking about disclosure. We're always talking about transparency. So Abby, do you want to just take that up?
Absolutely. Yeah. What Sarah's describing is really this evolution of different reporting mechanisms that have kind of evolved over time. There's financial materiality, which talks about disclosing information that helps investors make financial decisions about where to invest their money. And that's what we think of as outside looking into the company, right? Then there was a wave of impact materiality, and that's more about how do companies disclose the impact that their business is having on society, on employees, on the communities in which they operate. And that really is inside looking out, right? Impact. And with some of these new regulations, we're seeing this idea of both financial materiality and impact materiality, which we call double materiality. And what's really hard for a lot of companies, and it goes to the question that was in the chat about how do you deal with different jurisdictions and different requirements. At my firm, we advise global clients all the time who, operate in Europe and the US. And even within the US, in different states, there's different accountability from different regulators. And I think it's a challenge for a lot of companies to find the right path forward. But what I like to think is we need leaders and we need leadership to say that they're going to be the ones who want to do right by their employees, who want to do right by society, and are willing to, kind of go outside the norm to make sure that they're disclosing everything that they can so that their stakeholders can hold them accountable to that.
That's great. I would add to underline for those who don't know is that the double materiality in a way is split into what's called a triple bottom line, which comes out of the Brundtland report in I think in '87, which is financial and economic materiality, and then social and environmental issues. And if you can quickly figure that out, that's how we get ESG, because the G obviously is the governance of the economic aspects of say a business. So all of this does actually tie together as we sort of work our way back through the history of it. David, do you want to add anything?
Well, just what you just last said. I mean, it's interesting to think about where the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility was in 1971 when we formed. And at that point, we were filing shareholder resolutions and to companies trying to get, based on a connection with then Desmond Tutu, later Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who really said to ICCR, utilize your role as shareholders in companies to get those companies to withdraw from South Africa until apartheid is dismantled. So in a way, that set the stage for our work. Not that we haven't worked on governance and economic, you have to, and environmental, but the social sustainability, the social aspects has been really paramount. And the paradigm has been human rights. So it's taken various forms, from getting companies to withdraw and then getting organizations using some of the capital that is a part of our members to get secondary loans, so that a woman in the townships would be able to get a loan to get a small business going. So there's a huge amount of change over those years. I think in part we're seeing now that a lot of our gains we're questioning because of some of the political pressures that are taking place right now, where some companies are shifting from more of the social, environmental governance model and very cautious. Others are continuing to implement that without being public. And then there's some that are public. They see, like a Costco sees, they can't really think about their business model moving forward without diversity, equity, inclusion. They're not going to give that up. So I do think, though, that when we're looking at the full ecosystem, shareholders, investors have a lot of responsibility, because too often we've said, companies, you do it. This is what we want you to do, rather than looking at the investor processes. But I do feel like there is an opportunity, particularly in areas of modern slavery, forced labor, where, like you mentioned, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, we have been a part of a coalition of about 600 groups, including about 70 Uyghur groups that has been working together. So that's a kind of non-governmental, but some academics, some investors, et cetera, that are part of that. We need to work together, though. We need to find ways of connecting so that as we face challenges, and we are facing challenges now, that we are able to look at the stakeholder map and not just have it as a map, but in it, start building those trust relationships, and from bottom up, top down, to really see where we can make progress even in difficult times.
Thank you, David. So I'm going to just a few things. Those who don't know, when Sarah mentioned Enron, if you haven't seen the documentary Smartest Men in the Room, that talks about Enron and the failure, but it also talks about, in talking about adaptation, it talks about the demise of Arthur Andersen. So those who are old enough to remember Arthur Andersen and the fact that it no longer exists, which is was the big five accounting firms, now the big four because Anderson's went down. They were the auditors of Enron. And unfortunately, you can watch the documentary. The second thing I mentioned is there's also the work of Lynn Stout, who I'm sure Sarah knows, who did great work on shareholder primacy. Unfortunately, passed away from cancer, but she wrote a very good short book, 100 pages or so, on shareholder primacy and stakeholder theory. It's worth checking out. So just to go here, we're going to turn towards faith and organizational culture, and I want to frame this by just going back to antebellum slavery and reminding all of us that faith was a fundamentally important part, both unfortunately in the exploitation of Black Americans on slave plantations, but also as a place where they found solace and solidarity. So if you ever read the book, I think it's Caitlin Moran's book, Accounting for Slavery, you must first remember that those plantations were businesses in a straightforward and truest sense, and that faith was a part of what happened on those plantations in the organizational culture and structure. So this is a very important part. On my own experiences managing businesses in Asia, if you went to a business in Thailand, you would see a Buddhist altar. Buddhism was part of everyday life within a corporation in Thailand. And if you ever managed a business where, for instance, in a Muslim country, then you will know that individuals want to go out and say prayers during the day, and that's considered to be a perfectly acceptable thing. So I frame it slightly. Now I'm going to turn it over to David to say a bit more perhaps about the role of faith in setting the corporate tone, in corporate culture, and I think in integrity that he mentioned earlier on.
Well, thank you. It takes so many forms. I think concretely, I'm thinking of two things. One is faith has informed so much over time. For example, if you sit down and read the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that was formed by multiple faiths, the values out of that experience that get enshrined in human rights language. And so the dignity of the human person is so much a part of Catholic social teachings and other faith teachings, but it's also a fundamental principle of human rights. And so I think that's one piece. The second is, in our experience as investors, there have been instances where, for example, there was a campaign around sweatshop issues in Central America. This happened to be in San Salvador. And the Gap was one of the companies that actually began to do something because all the workers were fired. And we ended up working with the Gap to put independent monitoring groups together. But the Gap got engaged for a variety of reasons, including a barrage of letters from women religious that are members of ICCR to the head of the sourcing, who was really a devout Catholic. He really took his faith seriously. And that was a turning point, we learned. Once we sat down and talked and then worked for about 5 years on different areas. And it was really that acknowledgement that there are people in companies and in NGOs that really care, and their faith values and the values that emerge that really get implemented into the context of the business decision making. So I think another part of that is when you're working from the faith perspective, I think you're more likely than not to really pursue a variety of strategies, including a healthy dose of trust building. And when that trust is there, we found that the culture of corporations doesn't quickly change, but over time, over 10, 20, 30 years, you can see that. Now, we'd like it to be quicker in some sense. Some corporate, sort of business models are human rights violations there in certain areas. But I do feel like, Duncan, we underestimate the potential of faith and values-based approaches to transformation.
No, that's a very good point. I'm going to turn it to Abby, and then we'll circle and to Sarah, and then we'll come back to it briefly before we move on. But thinking of values-based versus, say, just duties-based, which would be legal, versus, say, just objectives or outcomes-based, I think is fundamentally important and often forgotten in the creation of corporate culture. Abby.
Yeah, I'm listening to David and what he was just sharing. And at one point in time in my career, I worked for an interfaith nonprofit. And really just to echo David's point, when different faith groups come together and organize, it's very powerful. And as I'm listening to everything we've kind of been talking about today, I've heard us talk about, okay, if you're an employee, what kind of impact can you have on your corporation? If you're within a community, what kind of impact can you have on a corporation? I also have heard us talk about, through some of the things that Sarah has said, how do we influence government to make demands of companies as well? And how do we pass law and legislation that helps ensure that we can actually make change and ensure that we reduce and eliminate and eradicate human trafficking? And I think that what is clear is that there's power in the collective. And so I don't know if I have more to add other than just to emphasize what David is saying, that faith groups of all kinds, when they work together, are an unstoppable force.
Thank you, Abby. It reminds me, if my Latin is still any good, the word religion is from the Latin ligare, to bind, to bring people together. And it's often forgotten that there is certainly nothing in the corporate world that could be described as binding apart from an agreement. So I think it does have that human trust, social and cultural and spiritual togetherness. Sarah?
Thank you. I couldn't agree more with what David and Abby have said. I think that faith informs so much of who we are and what we do, even if for those who are not religious, the metaphors, our language, even the language of fiduciary responsibility is really a faithfulness kind of language. And I think, Abby, you're so right that when people of faith come together, it can have a huge impact. I do want to say that I think, as people of faith, we need to focus on our common ground. It is so easy to get caught up in the atmosphere of divisiveness and to say, well, we're concerned about one issue, you are concerned more about a different issue. Of course, there are issues like that, but mostly there is common ground, and we have to find and unite.
Sarah has frozen, so hopefully she will come back. Stuart, could you just message Sarah just to tell her that she's frozen, please?
Yes, we'll do.
Thank you. What I'll do now is we're in the last few minutes. I want to turn this subject over to the issue of prevention. And first of all, Abby, what are your thoughts on what we can do to increase prevention? And this is a slightly biased subject because Praeveni's mission is to increase prevention. And Abby is also, very grateful Abby joined our board as well. So hopefully top of mind, Abby, any thoughts on prevention and where corporate governance fits into that?
Can you hear me? Sorry about that. I had also a little glitch there. Yeah, so prevention is so critically important. And part of the work that Duncan and I get to do together is all about prevention. I think one of the things that has always stood out to me is that, and this comes from a fellow friend of ours, Kevin Highland, is we have to make human trafficking a crime that no longer pays. So there's estimated to be about 49.9 million victims globally of human trafficking. But there's only about 5,500 convictions, which means that we are nowhere near getting the kind of justice that we need for victims of this crime. That's going, I think, a little bit out of the topic in terms of governance, but it's truly such an important part to me in understanding how to prevent this horrific crime from ever happening. So yeah, when it comes to prevention, to me, that's the biggest thing, is we have to have consequences for the bad actors, and we have to ensure that victims are restored and made whole.
Just to emphasize that point, Abby, which is great, is in terms of the number of corporate prosecutions and convictions, it's ostensibly zero. I was involved in probably the first criminal investigation into a Fortune 500 company, which was only 3 years ago, and that was Goodyear. And the Fortune 500, for those who don't know, are responsible for 1/3 of global GDP. And only one company has ever been investigated for this issue. So there is a lot of work to do on prevention, investigation, and prosecution. David.
Real briefly, because I know we're running out of time. One very clear example for me of prevention is the work we've done, and then a lot of other groups have done. But in 2014, we started at ICCR a program where no worker should ever pay for a job. The employer pays is really the principle. And no worker should have to, be confiscated, passports, personal papers. No worker should be hired without a written contract, terms and conditions. So when we implemented that, we recognized that so too often our members, and rightfully so, were really focused on the factory or the farm. But how did workers get there? So there really is a prevention related to that whole foreign migrant recruitment issue. Right now, that too many times workers are still paying exorbitant prices to get that job, and they're bonded, they're modern slaves in workplaces. But it's in the interest, of course, for the workers to get reimbursement. But rather than always reimbursement, why don't we start with the prevention so that then the company and the supplier is not on the hook for repayment as a part of a remediation process. So it's in the interest, I think, of companies and suppliers as well as workers to have a principle that the employer pays for recruitment. And one of the key forms of modern slavery and forced labor is the recruitment of job seekers who, of course, are leaving their country to go to another to help their families back home, and never get to that point if they're highly in debt and almost bonded laborers. So I think that's a really critical governance issue as well, because companies have adopted those policies. And of course, Kevin Highland has been a part of a process that we've been a part of, the Leadership Group for Responsible Recruitment. Workers, we have migrant worker groups as well as companies, as well as a whole range of non-governmental organizations.
Thank you, David. Sarah, we're sorry to lose you. So we moved on to prevention. I'm going to give you the final word on prevention. What should we be doing in relation to corporate governance to improve it, so that we have better measures of prevention throughout the corporate structure and the corporate organizational culture?
Thank you. I apologize. We had a brief power outage here. But yeah, I think that what you all have been saying is so important. I totally agree that there have to be consequences. And I want for what happens with respect to human trafficking, modern day slavery. And I think that those consequences, we know how to impose consequences. Delaware may be the most management friendly of jurisdictions, but if directors authorize an improper distribution of corporate assets, an improper dividend payment, or an improper stock repurchase, they can be held personally liable. I'm not trying to be draconian and saying we have to immediately impose personal liability, but I am saying we should move in the direction of having very clear consequences. I think we can learn a lot in that way. There's been, really since the early 2020s, there's been a convergence with respect to anti-corruption and anti-slavery efforts. I think that we in the anti-slavery area have a lot to learn from what's happened in the anti-corruption area, development of tools that are really important. We can work together. We have different strengths to strengthen those tools. And once again, I think that from a perspective of people of faith, people who are faithful, even if they're not religious, we need to be working on common ground, identifying that common ground and working at both the macro and the micro levels. The macro levels, the work that David, that the Interfaith Center for Corporate Responsibility, that the International Justice Mission, that so many of the organizations, Duncan, that you've been affiliated with, and you have, Abby, are working at that higher level. But we also have to be working in congregations. We have to be out there in public doing what we can to serve as awareness raising organizations and people who are there to be able to counsel people and talk with the folks who are in our pews, who are related to our congregations, about the problems and about what they might do about them, and helping them realize that we can do something about this if we just try, not only as investors, which is really important, but also as individuals who are working for these large companies and for all companies that have the potential to have human trafficking, slavery in their supply chains.
Thank you very much, Sarah. We have run out of time, and I will finish on this point of personal liability. When I was doing investigations with federal agents, they asked me who they should subpoena. And my attitude was, let's think about the corporation, the governance. Human resources, subpoena them. Head of legal, responsible for contracts, workers no contracts, got to be them. And the chief sustainability officer, because let's face it, in that person's remit is social and environmental issues. And I think there has to be an increasing amount of personal responsibility for the lack of governance at the top about what happens to people who unfortunately have been hired at the bottom of these organizations. I want to thank all of our speakers, Abby, David, and Sarah, and we'll be back with something next month, and please look out for that. But thank you very much, everybody, and look forward to seeing everyone again.
Thanks very much.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.